So, um, without any further ado, I would like to introduce Nadim Lipka, who is going to introduce our first guest speaker.
Thank you, Paul. Welcome to the workshop. It's my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Aaron Hertzmann. Aaron earned his PhD in computer science at the New York University in 2001. He has been a professor at the University of Toronto for 10 years and has worked at companies like Pixar Animation Studios and Microsoft Research. Aaron is currently a principal scientist at Adobe Research and an affiliate professor at the University of Washington. He's also an ACM fellow and an IEEE fellow for his contributions to computer graphics, non-photorealistic rendering, computer animations, and machine learning. He pioneered the use of data-driven approaches in machine learning for the creation of visual content. His work on graphics design and computational aesthetics introduced seminal ideas in these domains, and his algorithm on non-blind deconvolution is a major milestone in the field of computational photography. In his own words, his work seeks to address the following questions. What powerful tools can we provide to artists, designers, scientists, and novice users for creating beautiful, expressive, artistic, and illustrative imagery and animation? And how can we visually understand the world, extracting meaning from images and model the human visual system? In his keynote today, he will discuss whether computers could create art by using AI. Please welcome to the camera, Aaron Hertzmann.
Great, thanks so much for the kind introduction. Could you enable screen sharing for me? All right, so hopefully you either see my slides or they are about to appear. Just a little bit about my background. I double majored in art and computer science in undergrad, and I still paint sort of as an amateur. And I also work as a researcher developing methods in computer graphics and computer vision for generating and understanding artistic styles of images as well as other things. And hopefully by now you should be seeing my slides. And so in the past few years, we've seen a tremendous amount of excitement and interest in AI for image synthesis and artistic applications, which has been really exciting to watch. I think that it became publicly visible and generated a lot of excitement initially through the deep dreams method, and then through neural style transfer methods, which were implemented in a bunch of popular apps, including phone apps, and a lot of selfies and profile pictures were stylized this way. And then people just started to explore all these other different ways to make things with AI and machine learning algorithms, such as neural network generated movie scripts and neural network generated band names, neural network generated knitting patterns. And so then there's this range of these fun applications. And then artists started to really explore these ideas. So this is the first gallery show exhibition I started to see using, in this case, deep dreams and style transfer. And actually some fairly big name artists like Trevor Paglen, Jason Salavon, Gillian Waring have explored at some point using neural network methods in their art and works that have been shown in galleries and museums. And actually Jason Salavon now has a big installation at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston using around some of these ideas. So then these ideas then became more visible in popular culture.
I like it. It's really cool. So who painted it? A machine.
It's actually the first work of art made by AI to be sold.
So you should have seen a video with audio there. Let me know if not. That video clip was shown in May 2018. 6 months later, a artwork generated by created by artists using GANs was auctioned at Christie's for $500,000, and they signed it actually with a loss function that's used to train GANs. And these things are also, playing a big role in the academic world. So here's one research paper that writes in their abstract: we propose a new system for generating art. The system generates art by looking at art and learning about style and becomes creative. So these are fairly strong words, and they directly begin to appear in the news media descriptions of these things. So in this work, the headlines say, artificially intelligent painters invent new styles of art. And as we go down and down the food chain, Daily Mail says the AI artist that can create its own painting style, and critics even prefer some of its work to human efforts. And these kinds of descriptions of the artist, the AI, the algorithm as creative, as the inventing these new styles, becomes pretty widely understood, I think, by the public. So here's Jerry Saltz, who is probably one of the premier art critics in the world, describing these works, and see how he describes the agency of the software.
Initial thoughts, incredibly dull, generic, boring. The programmers are not freeing up the program. I want the robot to tap into its inner robot. Be
so he's
free.
totally bought into this idea of the robot as being this autonomous artist expressing itself, and and creating this work like all the normal cliches about artists. And so there is a real serious question here, I think, which is, can computers create art? And there's also it's hard to even phrase what that question means. It's not exactly clear what even is the question, because sometimes people ask this purely as a question of technological capability. Like, if we have enough teraflops in our NVIDIA card, then we have an artist. Other times people say, when I have informal conversations about this with people, they say, no, of course not. Art requires intent. Therefore, computers can't be artists. And I think more generally, a lot of us have this intuition that art is some purely human activity. It's like having consciousness, or like having a soul. It's some like real deep mystical thing that you do. And I think there's some reality to that intuition, but it's not a particularly scientific statement. It'd be nice to have something more concrete to lean on. So the question I would phrase is, will we as a society ever credit AI algorithms or software as the author of the artwork, rather than the person who ran or used that software? And so the main points I want to make in this talk are, first, that AI tools are, like any other technology, can be used as tools for artists. They advance the field and they empower artists. And since this workshop is about design, I would say a lot of the same thing is true for design. In the context of design, we can create lots of tools to automate font placement or color choices, like in the slide that Paul just showed. But in the end, it's really a designer who's making the choices, and they're the author of that work. The second point I want to make is that I believe only social actors can make art, and that currently means humans. And it means something very specific by that, which I'll explain later. And I think there are scenarios, hypothetically, in which AI could be considered artists, or they may be in the future, but these are really unlikely. These are really science fiction scenarios. And at the end of the talk, I'll spend about 10 minutes also talking about sort of what's going on in the AI art world, because I think it's a really exciting thing to watch, and there's a lot going on. Now, before we get to talk about the present or the future, I think it's worth talking about the past and the ways that these trends have manifested over and over again. And we see that technology has always transformed art throughout history. So we can look at the Renaissance era, when Van Eyck developed new methods for oil painting. Before that, the dominant technique was fresco, which had a lot of practical difficulties, but you could also see that it had limitations in the kind of tones and detail you could get with fresco. And oil paint really made the gave artists much more richer control over tone and detail. And again, it made creative practicality, made it easier to work in a studio or move outside. Through the Western tradition over the following several hundred years, one thread of activity was to make art more and more visually realistic. And I think it may be hard to appreciate this right now, how in our today's world, we are saturated with images, with photographs, and we can take pictures easily, we can share them easily, we see them all around us. But 200 years ago, this must have seemed like a really rare and special thing to see such a vivid depiction of reality. And so the artists over the centuries got better and better at creating these kinds of naturalistic images. And so to the extent where their identity was highly tied up into their ability to do this. So an artist is someone who can create these realistic images as well as making them beautiful and expressive and so on. And so it was a threat to these when hobbyists and tinkers start to experiment with photography. This is the first, probably the first known photograph created by someone who's just, again, playing around with his own chemicals in at his home. And so there's people who started to experiment with trying to record images through chemistry and optics. And so, of course, they had to create their first, Instagram of their own meal. This picture here is probably the first recorded photograph that has a person in it. In the lower left, maybe you might be able to see my cursor. There's a gentleman standing on the left there. And because exposures were so long, it took, I think this is the 30-minute exposure, or maybe 10. The reason why that person's captured is there, why he was standing still long enough is he was getting his shoe shined. But once you could do that, of course, it was to take selfies. But things really blew up when Daguerre in 1839 presented the method for the daguerreotype. And because the French government felt that this is important to society, he did not patent it. Instead, the French government paid him out so he wouldn't patent it. So anyone could use it who had, of course, the right time and equipment and so on and interest. And suddenly there was a method that lots of people could use to record images optically. And in one of the very first expositions of this technique, the classical painter Paul Delaroche was quoted as saying, "From today, painting is dead, because here's a machine," it is implied, "that automates what the artist does." Now, what really happened when photography was invented? Well, photography actually had a lot of different kinds of impacts on art. So one form, maybe the most practical form of art, or most functional, is portraiture. So then as now, people care a lot about having their portraits painted. We want pictures of our friends and our family and loved ones, ancestors. And if you're extraordinarily wealthy, then you can have a painting like this made. For the middle classes, there were simpler techniques like the silhouette, the paper cutouts that were widely used. And you can see that this obviously falls short as a way of recording what someone looks like. You just get their profile. So when photography was invented, within the following decades, and as the technique was improved, many portrait artists and silhouette artists had to switch to using photography. They had to learn the new technique. And even though photography was a fairly difficult process, so because of these were long exposures, like 10 minutes to record an image, you had to tightly grip your chair and wear your hold your head in a brace so you didn't move during the time of this exposure. And yet, as a result of the existence of this, now we have these incredibly beautiful and detailed images of what people looked like. So this is Matthew Brady, the Civil War photographer, and we have just such incredible detail of these all these people. An interesting anecdote to illustrate the role of the photographer in this process is the George Sand's portrait. So she's like one of the preeminent novelists of the day in France, and she went to get her portrait taken, and she went to a cheaper cut rate kind of photographer, and she got this picture, which she hated, and she wanted all copies of it destroyed because it was such a poor representation of her. And again, like she's like one of the leading minds of her generation. And so she went to Nadar, who's who's a very colorful character, this photographer. And he spent a lot of time with her, and they were also friends. And the end of this whole long process, this is the portrait of her that he took, which is such a superior picture for a lot of reasons. And so his craft and skill in the process played a huge part of that. So it's pretty clear that this is taking over portraiture. And even this one painter is quoted as saying that photography harmed painting considerably and killed portraiture, especially once the livelihood of the artist. So this is someone who really identifies painting and portraiture as the same thing, and he didn't see photography as portraiture. But on the sort of higher end scale, so anyway, so to summarize, basically portraiture became completely taken over by photography. But on the higher end, more like discussion of high art or fine art, there was this debate that went on for many, many decades. Is photography art? And on one hand, there were a number of photographers who are hobbyists and who experimented with it and tried to create nice images and beautiful art through photography. In any new artistic technology, one of the strategies that artists take is to replicate existing styles. So there was a style called pictorialism, in which photographers would create these tableaus. This is composition of multiple exposures, exploring classical themes of death or of moral purity. And these are cases where photographers are creating these sort of images that look like classical paintings with photography. And as these techniques developed, photographers found different styles and became more and more appreciated. And it took maybe it looks like about 60 years until I think in 1908, the first museum show showed photography as art. And this is after there have been decades of societies of photographers with their own journals and salons and so on. And they finally got recognition as these works really are considered art. On the other side, there were the traditionalists like the grumpy poet Charles Baudelaire, who wrote in review of a photography salon in the 1860s or 1859 that if photography is allowed to stand in for art, it will corrupt it completely thanks to the stupidity of the multitude. The artists themselves then were really faced by this challenge, though. If a machine can make these realistic pictures, then what does the artists do? And so Whistler wrote, "The imitator is a poor kind of creature. If the man who paints only the tree or flower or other surface he sees before him were an artist, the king of artists would be the photographer. It is for the artist to do something beyond this." And so his answer to this challenge was these nocturnes, like the image on the right, which is a sort of gauzy, atmospheric thing that the prior pictorialist photographs were not doing. Van Gogh, in his pivotal year of 1888, wrote to his brother, "Accurate drawing is not the essential thing to aim at, because the reflection of reality in a mirror would not be a picture at all, no more than a photograph." So now we're seeing this break from realism, that this picture is not meant to look real at all. There's something there the artist is doing that a camera couldn't do. Munch wrote, "I have no fear of photography as long as it cannot be used in heaven or hell. In hell, I'm going to paint people who breathe, feel, love, and suffer." So he's really treating art as expression and not realism. And several decades later, in the beginning of the Dada and Surrealist movements, by the 1920s, people looked back and said photography basically ended photorealism. So they wrote, "The invention of photography has dealt a mortal blow to the old modes of expression in painting as well as poetry. Since a blind instrument now assured artists of achieving the aim they had set themselves up for, they now aspired to break themselves of the imitation of appearances." So to summarize all that, at first it looked like photography automated art. It does the things that artists do and the way they identify themselves. And many artists at the time feared and they disparaged it. What really happened is we have a new art form, photography, which is respected as an art form in its own right. The old alt forms were forced to change. They were invigorated. And in fact, we may not have had modern art if it were not for photography. The more functional portrait mode of role of art, as well as other functional roles of recording, engineering projects and so on, these were replaced with photography. And finally, image creation became much more widely available to hobbyists. And now we all basically carry cameras in our pockets, and we have these abilities to communicate and share that were not available 200 years ago. So all in all, I would view photography as having an extremely positive and invigorating effect on the arts. Now, since the modern art movement, art changed dramatically and over those decades. And with conceptual art and the ready-mades, like Duchamp's famous fountain shown here, really whatever an artist does can be art. It's much more longer discussion of whether it's viewed as art or whether it's good art in any way or beautiful or useful. But kind of as a first approximation, we would say that like someone who's an artist can declare any activity they do as to be art, whether or not that's worthwhile. And in this discussion, I would also take a fairly broad view of art as being, including painting and conceptual art, but also music and dance and movies and theater, novels and video games. And in some way, a lot of design, there's a fairly blurry boundaries between what we consider art, what we consider design. I feel like design also shares a lot of the same properties of what we often call fine art as well. Within this conceptual art framework, there was development of more procedural methods where people really express the idea that the artist is the one who sets up the system. So John Cage would roll dice to create music or poetry. And Saul LeWitt, in his formulation of conceptual art, wrote that the instructions that he wrote for creating paintings were really the artwork, not the paintings themselves. And so he would write down long sets of instructions on how to paint one of his pictures. And these are, the measurements and the dimensions and the colors to use. And now it's possible to buy a new Saul LeWitt artwork from his foundation, and the painters will come from the studio and follow his instructions and paint a new Saul LeWitt, even though he had passed away. As soon as people started to figure out how to make images with computers in the 1960s, people started to create art with them and started to explore generative art, where people would write code that generate arrangements of patterns and lines. And when I say write code, they didn't have code back then. It was really like plugging in wires and tubes. And this is before punch cards, but before assembly code. It was like very, very, very low level early computer programming. One of the most significant computer artists of the 20th century is Harold Cohen, who had a classical education. He went to a well-known art school. And the way he would paint in watercolor is he wrote down a set of rules about how he should draw brush strokes. And then he would follow those rules mechanically. And then in the early 70s, he discovered Fortran, and it was like, well, why am I doing this by hand? And he fell in love with it. He started writing code, and he spent the rest of his career, about another, I think, 50 to 60 years, developing more and more sophisticated software that would generate art. And many of his computer-generated works are shown are in collections in major galleries like Tate and MoMA and so on. As digital desktop publishing and home computers became more popular, more artists, explored it. Here's a, Amiga drawing by Andy Warhol, and every single, at every decade, the people are continually asking: is this art? Is a computer a tool, creative expression? Can the computer be the artist? Two more sort of AI artists, I think, as significant are Carl Sims and Scott Draves, who both built evolutionary systems that would optimize or evolve creative screensavers or artificial life that were quite inspiring and intriguing in a lot of different ways. And these were essentially large-scale AI systems. Within the more popular arts, computer animation is probably the most prominent sort of computer-based art form. And it's really something which has arisen out of a collaboration of artists and scientists. I think a lot of sort of lay people view this sort of assume the computer did everything, and it's really not the case. And it's also something which originally animators felt threatened by. So in the early days, Lucasfilm Graphics Group, Ed Catmull and Ellie Ray Smith would take trips down to Disney to try to convince animators and executives to use their software. And they said that the animators were frightened of the computer. They felt it was going to take their jobs away. And they spent a lot of time trying to tell them it's just a tool, it doesn't do the creativity. And in fact, computer animation, as you probably know, is an extraordinarily labor-intensive task. Huge amounts of work by highly trained, talented people to create seconds and seconds of motion. And when you look at the film credits for any animated movie, or quote live action movies have a lot of animation in them, you see hundreds and hundreds of people were involved in making this stuff. My own background came from computer graphics research, where developing methods to create paintings and drawings based on my own experience in studying painting. And here's one work that I did in which, as you walk canvas, it creates a painting of you. And this is a purely procedural algorithm where I've written some code which defines rules for how brush strokes are placed as a function of the input video. And this was shown in a few art fairs and expositions around New York City. And so again, it's, it's a painter, but it's still, I can tell you, the rules, or you can read the paper to see exactly what are the rules that this system uses in order to create these paintings autonomously. Because of the difficulty in defining these rules, I also explored using data. So here's a method I developed in 2001 that can take a photograph and stylize it in the style of an example illustration. Here it's using the pastel drawing style in the upper right. So the main point I want to make from all of these examples is all the stuff we call computer-generated art is human-made, whether it's Pixar animations or video installations. There's 50, 60 years of history of people writing code with computers to make art, and it's the human that is the one making the art and authoring that system, designing the rules for that system. On the other hand, there has been just in the same period of time an enormous amount of hype around AI. It's come and gone, of course, but even in 1958, the first development of the perceptron, the New York Times reports that this computer will be able to walk, talk, see, write, reproduce itself, and even be conscious of its existence. And this is describing a perceptron, which is a linear classifier, which is trained with a rule less sophisticated than gradient descent. And from that, people are extrapolating to consciousness. In reality, these AI systems are not intelligent. Most AI systems are basic, or what we call machine learning these days is data fitting lines to a curve. And one article, I think, which really goes into this very nicely is this article by Rod Brooks that I recommend. And yet, we're seeing all this hype around it. And when in reality, about AI art, and like I said, I think that all of these things we've seen so far are the results of human artists manipulating and controlling computer systems and creating the results. And even with the new AI art, which I'll say a little bit more about that later on, but so Helena Saren's one of my favorite AI artists, and she describes how her watercolor teacher would say, let the medium do that. And when she's manipulating her GANs, her generative adversarial network, she's kind of controlling this system. She's not just letting the computer do all the work. And if you've ever worked with watercolor, you know that it feels like it does have kind of a mind of its own, and you have to learn to work with the watercolors, sort of the way that it behaves, and not just tell it what to do. A lot of these things we're calling AI art these days involve a lot of curation and manual control. So here's the process that one artist has created in order to curate both the results of his generated imagery as well as to provide the training data for the next round of training. And this is an artist who also manipulates neural networks a lot. Like he removes layers and swaps them around and stuff in ways that are not the way you would normally train a machine learning model. I actually think not only should we not call these people's computer systems artists, I think there's some danger in doing so because it gives the wrong understanding to the public around how these systems work and how intelligent the system is. If someone creates a GAN or a procedural system that authors how that system behaves, and then you say that this system is the artist, then people will infer all sorts of other attributes for that system. They'll think it's intelligent and consciousness and feeling and so on, because these are all attributes we associate with being an artist. And I think this supports the notion of AI as being actually intelligent. And we've seen a lot that there are indeed a lot of dangers to this in the world, that it's actually can be harmful for society if people are allowed to present AI as if the AI itself is rational and optimal and intelligent. So that was all discussion of the computer systems we have today, but there's still this open question of whether computers in the future could be artists.
Can a robot write a symphony? Can a robot turn a canvas into a beautiful masterpiece?
Can you?
So again, it's a difficult question. It's difficult to even phrase the question. But I also even want to preface this discussion by saying it's hard to even make long-term predictions in general in almost anything. So if you had asked people 60 years ago, what will the city of the year 2001 look like? They'd say, well, we'll be on the moon in our space bubbles that we got there by Pan Am with our rocket cars. And then if you go back and ask people 60 years ago, what will the computer 2001 look like? They might, if they say anything at all, they might say, well, it'll be small enough to fit in a room and calculate 100 digits of pi in less than a second. And so our science fiction predictions about how our technologies will evolve and affect us often turn out way wrong. And all of our, our science fiction is interesting and useful to think about these things, but it often gives us a really skewed view of the future. And we just know. Nobody 60 years ago foresaw the internet and the way mobile phones and social media would affect our lives when these are probably the most important effects in technology, aside from climate change. And so today we're getting all of these huge, wildly varying predictions about the effect of AI and all the things it's going to do for or to us, and these just seem all kind of a little bit off, unconnected to the technology we actually have. On a more serious note, we look at, I think when people talk about their computers being artists, there's certain trends I see. And so let's come back to Harold Cohen, because I think his path is, I find instructive.
Ten years after that, I would have said, look, the program is doing this on its own. Another 10 years on, and I would have said, the fact that the program is doing this on its own is the central issue here. It was producing complex images of a high quality, and I could have had it go on forever without rewriting a single line of code. How much more autonomous?
So in other words, at first he is thinking, I've written software that produces high quality images that are being shown in galleries, and it can just keep doing this forever and ever. And he's essentially implying maybe this thing is an artist as a result of that.
Well, of course, that's exactly the point. It's virtually impossible to imagine a human being in a similar position. The human artist is modified in the act of making art. For the program to have been similarly self-modifying would have required not merely that it be capable of assessing its own output, but that it had its own modifiable worldview to provide a basis for any.
So there's this common trend, I think, a lot of people go through when they think about these things. They think, well, if I just make a computer that makes great images, then I've made an artist. And then as you keep pressing the button and seeing it make this kind of the same stuff, it's kind of the same style over and over again, you think, well, maybe it's missing something. And then in his case, he says, well, maybe it should grow and have a worldview. And so I call these attribute theories of art. They say, someone articulates an artist is someone who does X. And maybe X is that it makes art, that it's creative, or the results are surprising, or it has intent. And you can say, well, if I build a computer that has that attribute X, then I made an artist. And then if you actually try to build that thing, then it always feels like there's something missing. And all these systems are still human driven, and they're still kind of dumb systems building, just following our instructions. And we don't even require these systems. We don't require all these attributes of humans. Children can make art. You don't have to be showing your stuff in galleries to be an artist. It's really, I think art is for everyone. And bad art is still also art. One of these attributes people say is that art requires intent, or art requires expression. And I think these things are easy to automate. It would be super easy to write a system that generates intent or expression, or you can use GPT-3 to generate your artist's statement, and then generate again with Clip that does those things. And you're still going to say, well, it's still not. Why is that an artist? And in each of these cases, it's still like a dumb machine following its instructions. If you as a human sat down, or you told a human, gave a human, here are a whole bunch of instructions, follow these instructions to the letter, and in following those instructions, a person made something beautiful or wonderful, would you say that they were the artist, even though they were following instructions precisely? I don't see why we'd say computers would if we went for humans. Sometimes when I've given this talk, someone has raised their hand and said, you should just look at the definition of art and that will tell you the answer to this question. And that doesn't really work because current definitions of art are attempts to describe existing practices. They're trying to give rules that explain why, for example, theater is art and not professional sports. They draw a line between the things we know to be art and those that aren't. And they don't really tell us who can be an artist, whether, an alien from space could be an artist or when they could be. And it generally seems that whatever an artist does can be art. And so the real question is what can be an artist and who can be an artist? And for inspiration for this, I really am inspired by the evolutionary theory of art, which I find persuasive in this book. The Art Instinct is one of the best books I've read on art. I really, really recommend it. And it says that, it presents an argument of why we create art for evolutionary purposes, is that the role of art for our Pleistocene ancestors was for sharing and for gifts, for displays of fitness, for mating, and displays of social status and tribal affiliation, and communication, especially storytelling. And I observe that all of these different roles, especially the first three, are really about things we do for our social relationships to affect how we feel about others and how they feel about us, or to communicate these things. And so I would hypothesize that art can only be created by agents capable of these social relationships, or perhaps art can only be created by social actors. And so, computers may be able to do all the things that we associate with art making, relationships with them. If we don't care about how they feel about us, then we wouldn't see them as artists. Now, there are a few examples of non-human artists we can look at. There are a few cases of animals that have been presented as artists. And a lot of the discussion around them has been, well, does the animal, painting as an aesthetic object in its own right, or just as they enjoy the act of flinging paint? And so we have the discussion where we see our animals, like, does the animal want to give this as a gift to the trainer? So we see them as potential, as when we have these relations with them, we do see them as potential artists. And the question is really more, do they view the activity of art itself as valuable? On the other hand, we see natural processes like landscapes and flowers, and that we find beautiful and sublime, and can really have powerful effects on us, as powerful as any artwork. But we don't generally consider nature or the natural processes to be artists. So this is really a case where we get all of the benefits of art from these phenomena, but we don't consider there to be an artist involved. And I do think that artist authorship and process matters when we consider any artwork, where it comes from. So this is an image by Tom White that I have at home, which I like a lot. And I think it's something where a lot of people just kind of pass by it without paying a lot of attention to it. Well, I tell them where it came from, which is that he created this image by running an optimization that arranges brush strokes on an image to optimize the objective that lots of different conventional image classifiers recognizes with 99% probability to be a cello. So if you upload this to Google Cloud API or run any ResNet ImageNet classifier, they all say with extremely high confidence this is a cello. And to me, that's what makes the work interesting, as well as the appearance of it. Sometimes people also say, well, I make art just for myself, so doesn't that disprove my theory? And I think there are a lot of evolved behaviors that end up being pleasurable for their own sake. We have evolved skill of running for survival, for chasing or being chased, but now people do it, run just for fun or for exercise. And we talk, we have the ability to talk for our communication. People will talk to themselves or sing in the shower or whatever, and that doesn't disprove the evolutionary value of speech. So with that background, we can then, I want to propose some answers to the question of when can a computer be an artist? So if we really have human level AI and consciousness, then of course, yes, these things can be artists. But this is science fiction. This is not something we may have 50 years, 100 years. Who knows if it is even possible? On the other hand, we have social agents. We have examples of agents that people have had social relationships. And these are like chat bots like Eliza and Twitter bots, Amazon, Alexa, Siri, Cortana, Neko Therapeutics, Neko Atsume, and Pero Therapeutic Seals. And these are all cases where people have had social relationships with them. But once you tell them people understand it's just an algorithm, like has happened with Eliza, then they get upset. They feel cheated. And so I think it's possible that people could have view these things as artists, but probably if they're being fooled, if they don't really understand how the algorithm works, and I think that would be unfortunate. And finally, with our non-social software, where you git pull from a repo and twiddle some parameters and produce some images, I just don't see how anyone who understands how those algorithms work could view them as artists. And again, as with photography, I want to reiterate that new technology helps art stay vital, and art that doesn't change can grow stale. And it's impossible to predict specific ways in which this happens. So here's Les Paul, who's one of the main innovators of the electric solid body guitar, and he played very nice show tunes and swing jazz and country music. There's just no way he could have predicted the way that his invention would have transformed popular music in the subsequent decades. And I think the same thing is going to happen with AI tools and perhaps with design tools as well. And with that, I want to mention a few things about what's going on in AI art. And my main prediction here is that amazing stuff is coming out, is going to keep coming out, and we just can't predict how it's going to happen. Now, I just want to briefly mention non-AI world. There's just wonderful artists still working in procedural generative art, like Zach Lieberman, whose Instagram is a continual source of joy. Tyler Hobbs is another really great artist in the space. So these people are just completely purely code. And instantly, Zach Lieberman showed up in one of the Super Bowl commercials yesterday, writing code. So maybe the first Super Bowl commercial that had like real live code, visible on the screen. One trend in art that I'll mention, just one or two examples, is criticism of the social role of AI in general. So, for example, this is not procedural, but this is a work in which critiques the way that social recommendation algorithms can affect the way we see the world. There's also a variety of works such as these, which are different artists paint in such a way that faces cannot be recognized by a face recognition algorithm. A more pointed critique is ImageNet Roulette, which is trained on ImageNet labels in kind of a inaccurate way to highlight some of the worrisome data issues around data sets like ImageNet. And another even more poignant example is the white collar work, which is on the web, which is meant to critique the use of recidivism prediction and predictive policing to target disadvantaged communities. And here, this is a model which purports to predict where white collar crime and profile the appearances of the most likely subjects of that in New York. But to me, for the things that we're looking at here, I think the most interesting art is AI art and visual art. And generative adversarial networks are the one tool that have been the most popular and picked up by a lot of different artists like Mario Klingemann and Trevor Paglen, who have at least experimented with them in some way. There's also this sort of up-and-coming kind of more outsider group like Helena Stern and Sophia Crespo, who I think are doing really wonderful work, working outside of the mainstream, or starting outside of the mainstream more with like Twitter and online modes of sharing. And it's just so much fun to watch these people on Twitter share their experiments and how they evolve. You can just watch the things that they do. So Mario Klingemann shares lots of stuff, and this is one thing he just shared one day on Twitter. And this thing eventually, some future evolution of this ended up as an installation piece. And this installation was auctioned at Sotheby's, I think, for $500,000 or 50,000 euros. One observation I want to make about this work is that GAN art often exhibits something that is called visual indeterminacy, which is a term coined by Robert Pepperell to describe images that seem at first to appear like they should add up to something coherent, but as you explore the image, it doesn't, it never kind of like adds up. You can't tell where figure and ground is. And as images become more complex with this indeterminacy, they become more interesting. And in a way, this indeterminacy is one of the major trends of modern contemporary art. An early precursor to this is the work of Turner. You can tell maybe this is a sunset, but you can't identify the objects in it, even though it feels like you ought to be able to. But with Cubism and beyond, there was a real effort to subvert visual interpretation. So Picasso wrote, when looking at a picture, the more associations it can open up, the better. And there was a real deliberate attempt to make things ambiguous. And in contemporary art in general, ambiguity is now a highly valued attribute. You don't want, in contemporary art, we don't want images that make a clear statement. We want images that suggest many possible interpretations. One of my favorite contemporary painters, Gerhard Richter, has said, I don't like pictures that I understand. So this is an enunciation he painted. And he's even described a perceptual process that may explain what's going on here. He says, we only find paintings interesting because we search for something familiar. And usually we do find those similarities, table, blanket, and so on. And when we don't find anything, we are frustrated, and that keeps us excited and interested. And here's a painting by Rob Pepperell, who sort of coined this term visual indeterminacy. And when I first saw this image, I thought GANs, even though this was painted 15 years ago. And you can see, and so one observation I would make here is it kind of seems like GANs are naturally predisposed to producing these indeterminate images that look like modern art. And you can see this by experimenting with the general model and art breeder, which produces these images that are really evocative and suggestive of different kinds of content. But if you try to nail down the specific elements of what is specifically the shapes of objects in the scene and what exactly they are, these images defy that interpretation. And I think that sort of natural predisposition towards indeterminate images is what makes GANs so popular as a tool for contemporary art. And again, these artists are not just pressing buttons to make images, they are manipulating the models and messing them up in order to produce these indeterminate images. If you run StyleGAN, you can, FFHQ, every image can look great, but these artists are actually breaking that to produce these evocative indeterminate images. So that's a little bit about what's going on these days in the AI art world. So to conclude the talk, I think throughout history and now in the future, new technologies are tools that benefit art and artists. I believe art is a social activity. It's something that which is performed by social agents. And as a result, software won't become or be considered artists anytime soon, anytime in the foreseeable future. And conversely, I believe amazing new AI-driven art is coming. And there's so much here and there's so much that's yet to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron, for this talk. This is a fantastic overview, looking back at the history of art and using that to answer the question if computer can create art. I'd like to open this to a Q&A. We have about 15 minutes. I haven't seen any questions on the chat. So as we are a group with less than 20 people, I think we can do it that each one can join or unmute and then ask the question. Maybe you guys can think about some questions. I went through the talk and came up with some questions, but somehow you always answered them later part of the talk. But let's revisit some of these. So you're answering the question of can computer create art by looking at two other questions. First one is it art or not? And the second question would be, who's the artist? And first of all, maybe a more general question here is, why is the question of who the artist is so important in the field of art? Or isn't it?
Well, I think, well, there's many ways to answer that question. I think, when we look at artworks in general, we care about where it came from. And there's different points of view as to how much we should care. Like the Barth, say that there's like sort of a long postmodern strain of criticism that says we shouldn't pay attention at all. But we do care, and we care about where it came from, even if we don't believe we can understand the motivations of the artist. We want to be able to think about that. And in lots of cases, understanding the artist, who it is, really informs our understanding of the work. But I think with respect to the question of whether a computer can be an artist, we have to think about the role of, where this thing came from and whose job was what. There are lots and lots of examples in existing art forms where there are people who are involved in production. Maybe the person that we call the artist didn't touch the work itself, and yet the person who sort of was the mastermind behind the work is the one who's really considered the artist.
And then, so you look at the question of if the AI can be an artist more from the background of the artist, but cannot this be answered with some form of a Turing test, where a human kind of decides if something was created by a human or not?
Well, I don't really believe in Turing tests as a very reliable measure, or I mean, maybe it's partly about how you define the Turing test, because to some extent, you know, like GPT-3 now, like we have methods that can pass naive versions of the Turing test now. Like you can produce through machine learning pieces of text or images that you can't tell the difference, at least on the surface. But I think if you want to say, like, is the system that built that actually intelligent, then most people would say no when you actually understand how it works. So just being able to pass some Turing test is not really a very meaningful measure. Yeah.
And so you had the analogy to the invention of the photography, and explained how that was accelerating art, but then also that it kind of broke the photorealism. At the same time, you were arguing that it's kind of impossible to predict what AI would break, as a parallel would break in the future. But is there a clear, is there something today where we can see what it's breaking today and what it's accelerating today?
Well, I mean, I think the effect of modern AI tools has not really had a large impact on the broader world. And I think, you know, so much of the art show is broken in a way that, like, no form of art, I think, is going to have the just enormously transformative effect that photography had, because since the modern art era, our understanding of what art is has expanded so dramatically that it's hard to imagine expanding more. It's more that people might rethink you know, particular modes of expression. I think we'll, you know, within more popular forms, like what is in like computer animation tool, like character animation tools may make it much more automated, the actual production of animation, for example. But that's, again, more about transforming the tools rather than transforming the art form.
I give the token to Bill to get in with the question.
Thank you very much. Aaron, thank you for the talk. It was very enlightening. I kind of approached this from a different perspective, in that my background's in evolutionary biology, and I've you know, dabbled in evolutionary psychology and sociobiology. So I'm wondering what you think. You know, I actually think, you know, we have obviously a lot of cognitive biases. There are design principles based on our perceptual system, and that we're frankly, as humans, easily fooled. The idea of personification, right? Like many times I'll yell at my Alexa device, not yell, but actually treat it like it's a, you know, there's our natural propensity to personify technology. And so I'm wondering what you think about the ability of artificial systems to actually manipulate our biases and our perceptual system so that they do produce art. Because at the end of the day, I would argue that it's not who makes the art, but it's the emotional impact that it has on us. So, you know, which is the basis of advertising, for example. So if a system, an artificial system, can effectively design art so that it has an emotional impact on us by taking advantage of our limits to our cognition, then isn't that by definition art?
So with respect to the first thing you said about like the Alexa, like, so, you know, there's lots of, we have lots of emotional relationships with our devices and computers. And there's like some really nice study from 20 years ago or so by Cliff Nass, I think at Stanford, where they showed people really have like build these sort of social attachments to their computers in sort of unconscious ways, which I don't think is the same as having a social, really believing that their people are having social relationships with them. But with respect to your actual question, I think again, it goes back to this sort of attribute theories I'm talking about. When you say, I'm going to build a system that can manipulate our emotions in such a way does that make it art. If you actually build that actual system or go through the thought experiment for real, where someone has designed a system that's capable of doing that stuff, then at some point somebody had to design that algorithm. They had to set it up, make it work, even if there's like training or automation or evolution involved. And in the end, that system is still following a bunch of instructions. It's just like executing the code it was provided. And I think if you actually build that system, it's no different than any other art making algorithms that we have today.
Aaron, can you also share your perspective on what AI or what tools should we create next to
that gets any attention at all, then these people are like pulling the latest thing and just kicking the tires and playing around and posting the latest stuff. So especially you can see Janelle Shane has just posted some stuff recently using Dolly from DeepMind, which just came out in the past week, and suddenly people are like just really excited about Clip, which does some really impressive stuff. And so in a way, at least for this group of artists, the thing, just the latest developments in image synthesis is already just providing us so much to work with. And even BigGAN, as I understand it, it doesn't seem like it was intended, or GANs in general, as art making tools. And yet they've been such incredibly fertile tools for art.
Go ahead, Sue. We cannot hear you. Still no audio. Maybe in the meantime, how's the relationship between, so if we think of having a ton of algorithms that can produce different styles and have different parameters, there's always a kind of a selection problem behind the model selection problem or parameterization. So whose job is it to find the right parameters? I think there's certainly the scenario where the artist should be in control, but then there's other scenarios where, let's say, non-artists or not so much artists are trying to recreate a style that is was prescribed by some company policy or by some guidelines. That might be a scenario where the selection problem is more on the side of the AI, but do you have a perspective on this?
Yeah, so I guess I've primarily been focusing more on like sort of fine arts, which are more exploratory, and in these, the artists, different artists like to work in different ways, and some they're going to tweak the hyperparameters to get the results they want. In the design context, it's a lot more about getting a job done. Like, I want to follow the branding style of my corporation or my client, or I want to just execute on my vision. And so I think the creative separation people talk about the most is, I want the algorithm to be assistant to do what I say and not take creative agency away from me as a designer. So, I like to think of it as the algorithm should be like a really intelligent personal assistant. Like you say, make me a happy birthday photo design, and they produce a couple of, here are four options to work with. It's like, oh, I like that one, but make the font a little bit different. I want a font which is a little bit more professional, and like maybe add a little bit more of this, and then the person, okay, well, I'll just rearrange it and say no, more purple, and then it becomes more purple. And so I feel like all those different tasks steps are things for which we can develop better algorithms. We'll make better recommendations or make adjustments to designs based on guidance and feedback that doesn't mess up the thing that you liked about the design, but adjusts things appropriately. And there's also a third category, which is much more like novices, of people who like don't know anything about design at all, but they want to share Instagram posts with their inspirational or advertising messages. And for those, I think they really just, they're just going to be able to provide high level feedback. And the system's job is to match that feedback and, again, not get in the way.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Cool. Thanks for your talk. So my question is something related to initiative. So if you think about paintings, they do not have initiative. If you look at photographs, they probably do not have initiatives too. But then we are now looking at interactive AI agents. We're looking at these like an interactive tools that probably some people will say that they have initiatives. So what would you say about initiatives in the current AI context, and how would you relate it to, let's say, AI art and the future directions?
What do you mean by initiative?
So, for example, the camera is there. You pick up the camera, you take a photo. The camera cannot tell you anything. It cannot manipulate you. But now, if you, for example, let's say we look at some like mixed initiative tools, they can. For example, let's say if you're playing AI Dungeon, which is a tool where you play with an agent in an adventure where the AI agent can tell you something happened to influence you. That we say that this agent somehow, somewhat, have some level of initiative, unlike a camera, unlike a painting brush. Would you say that it relates to the current, let's say, context of AI? The AI art.
Somebody, again, has set up that system, that AI, to execute, and you press the button to tell the thing to go, and it then follows instructions about how it participates in whatever the process is. And the camera, it also, cameras are not objective tools. They record images in the way either film cameras, someone has designed the chemical process to capture light in a particular way and record a subset of photons and portray them in a particular way. And now modern cell phone cameras, a lot has gone into machine learning transformations of the input photons that produce nice images according to a aesthetic of some training data set that was used to train a model at Google or Apple. So there's these, I feel like this notion of initiative is really, it's still the system following its instructions, that someone says, press go on the algorithm and then manipulate it until it does the thing that the algorithm designer wants.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you again, Aaron. This was a great session. I learned a lot. We go into a break now for 10 minutes, and we continue with session 2 at 10:25, where we look at the 3 paper presentations for this workshop. Thank you.